Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here and thank you for organizing this session. So I'll start just by saying a little bit about myself and then cover a few things about LGBTQ plus economics. I think from my accent, it's obvious that I'm from Italy. That's also why I need to wear this microphone because I need to move my hands while talking. Otherwise, it's too hard for me. And that's where I got my undergraduate master's degree. And then I moved to the US, where I got my PhD from Georgetown University. And I also worked for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank while I was being there. And then I did my postdoc at the LGBT Policy Lab at Vanderbilt University. And after that, I needed a break from the US. And boy, I'm glad right now that I'm not in the US anymore, because most of my research will be banned or defunded, or I will be out of work. But yeah, right now I'm a senior lecturer here at Exeter, just down the road in the business school. And I started my academic career mainly working on education and gender, in particular looking at the underrepresentation of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But then I also did some stuff on AI and machine learning. And at some point, I got demotivated during my PhD. I was really thinking, is it worth doing that in a very competitive and stressful environment? And I decided, okay, I don't care if I really want to continue doing this, I better do something that I'm really passionate about. So no matter what my advisor thought, I decided to write my dissertation on LGBTQ plus issues, and in particular to focus on the impact of same-sex marriage legalization in the US on labor market outcome for gay and lesbian individuals, where I essentially show that same-sex marriage led to a decline in discrimination, which therefore led to higher employment outcome, better employment outcome for individuals in same-sex couples. And from that point onwards, I mainly work on LGBTQ plus issues. Since you are a STEM crowd, I think I should mention this one, where I essentially show that sexual minorities are underrepresented in STEM field using representative sample from the US. But unfortunately, I couldn't say anything about transgender individuals. And because of that, I work with a few scientists over the years to kind of lobby the National Science Foundation to include sexual orientation and gender identity questions in their survey. We had managed to convince them last year when they were piloting the question. And then I think this month, everything has gone away, which is a bit quite depressing because, again, it took us several years of lobbying, and unfortunately, that has been unfolded in a few weeks. The first thing that people always ask me is how many people are LGBTQ plus, and spoiler alert, I don't have a good answer to that, mainly because people tend to misreport to sexual orientation in surveys, including the UK census. But companies such as Gallup or Ipsos have tried to collect this information both in the US and in other countries for several years. And what you can see is that there's been a large increase over the years in the share of people identifying as LGBTQ+. In the US, this is now almost 8% of the adult population. But when you look at Gen Z, which is mainly college students, you get almost 1/4 of people identifying as LGBTQ+. And I don't agree, but people may say, oh, these people are experimenting with their sexuality, then they will realize that they're actually straight. And to which I reply, it pains me to say because I belong to this generation, to millennials, but millennials are not that young anymore. They're families, they're homeowners and so on, and still 10% of them identify as LGBTQ+. And something that I also like to always emphasize is that most of the research is focused on lesbian, gay, and now more and more on transsexual. Be with me, I'm sure it will come back. But the majority within the LGBTQ plus community is represented by bisexual individuals. And this is kind of an invisible majority because most of the research is actually not focused on them. And most people are not aware that this is the largest share. And it's also the fastest groups in terms of, especially when you look at younger generation, and include bisexual, queer, pansexual, and so on. Ipsos tried to conduct something similar in different countries around the world, I will take some numbers, especially in developing countries, with a pinch of salt, but you can see the UK, it's around 13%, and the global average is around 11% of the population. So quite consistent with what we got in the US, which I always emphasize when people tell me, oh, why should we study this? This is so niche. And I say, well, it's 10% of the population. It's not so niche. Also, in terms of macroeconomic effects, it's quite important. And you already saw on this slide, so I'm not going to focus on this. But again, there were also some issues with the census, and I think that's an underestimation of the population, especially because, as you were saying, there are some proxy respondents that the household health will respond for everyone in the house, and that reduce the share of people identifying as LGBTQ+. Now, that's all in terms of demographics. When it comes to legal framework, the sad reality is that in 12 countries right now, same-sex sexual intercourse among consenting adults is illegal and can be punished with a death penalty. And that's mainly in Middle Eastern countries, but still in many African countries, there is also still this kind of sodomy laws. And unfortunately, this is one of the success story of the British Empire, which was quite successful at exporting sodomy laws around the world. And it took centuries for countries to remove them from their legislation. For instance, the US removed them in 2003, India in 2018, and Singapore just a couple of years ago. So you can see that even high-income countries kept this kind of laws in their books for decades or even centuries. And you may argue that these laws were often not enforced, but there was this idea that homosexuals were by definition criminals, and that had a lot of long-term effects and also some backlashes. And when the slide will come back, you will also see that there is a big divide between Eastern and Western Europe. Don't ask me about Italy, otherwise I will get depressed. But the main idea is that the UK used to be at the top of the ranking for this kind of ranking in terms of LGBT laws. But right now it's more in the middle of the ranking, and the reason is that while other countries have passed more pro-LGBT legislation, the UK, for instance, still doesn't have a ban on conversion therapy. There are also a lot of issues regarding how to change sex markers in identity documents. And as you may well know, the Tory government and now the Labour government has supported this complete ban on puberty blockers for minors because of the cash review, which other countries such as Spain or Germany have contested. And so you can see that also at the international level, things are not moving in the right direction. So now I'm an economist, so let me try to convince you why economists should study these issues. And you can say that LGBT rights are human rights issues, but I also think that economics, the way I see it, it's focused on the allocation of scarce resources. And human capital, people, workers, are scarce resources. So when you have prejudice, discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, that leads to an inefficient allocation of these resources. And that's where economists really care about. So if a school fires a teacher just because they're gay, which used to happen in the US, that's not economically efficient. When companies don't hire the best candidates because of their gender identity, that is not profit maximizing. That's not what economic theory will suggest. And when companies refuse to bake a cake for a same-sex couple or for transgender individuals, again, they're not maximizing profits. And so economists care about these things, and that's why I think they should study these topics. And it took a while to get this field started in economics, much more than in sociology or in political science. But the first study started in 1995, and then it has kind of exploded in the past 5 years because there are more and more data that are becoming available. But what we've learned so far is mainly based in labor economics, and we can see that across countries and over time, we always observe a gay penalty in the sense that gay men in the labor market earn less compared to straight men. And this is compare individuals with the same education, the same experience, the same observable characteristics. Bisexual men and women also experience a penalty in terms of earnings in the labor market. Then for women, you actually observe a lesbian premium in the sense that on average, lesbian women tend to earn more compared to straight women. But I always like to emphasize that there is still a gender gap. All women, irrespective of their sexual orientation, earn less compared to straight men. So it's not that if we make all women lesbian, we will solve the gender penalty. It's always there. And I mean, I can talk a lot about this, why that is the case, and I'm happy to answer a question later on, but I think it's quite remarkable. You don't see a lot of econ statistics that are consistent across countries and across years, and this is something that people have found in Europe, in the US, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many other countries. And for transgender, if you had asked me a few years ago, what do we know about them in terms of economic outcome, I would say we don't know anything because there are no data about them. And in the past, again, 5 to 6 years, there have been a few data sets that have emerged. And what we can see is that if anything, they have lower employment rates and higher poverty rates compared to cisgender individuals. And in the US, this is especially true for Black trans people, but also in many other countries that's true for trans women. And one study that I find quite interesting, in the Netherlands, they've shown that the one that get penalized the most are transgender women, that when they transition, they get not only a transgender penalty, but also a gender penalty. So they see their earnings drop quite significantly. If anything, transgender men, they get a penalty for being transgender, but they get a little bump for becoming men. And so I think it's quite interesting that you see these gender differences even within the transgender community. So why should we care? And I think we can always make the human rights argument that we should care because LGBT rights are human rights. And I completely support that argument. The reality is that a lot of policymakers are not convinced by that argument. And so you can also make the economic and business case as a complement rather than a substitute for the human rights case. And so we can all argue that there are costs for individuals, for firms, and for society when it comes to homophobia and transphobia. There are costs for individuals because people tend to lose their family or their friends when they come out. LGBTQ plus individuals are also more likely to be victims of hate crimes. They have higher rates of suicide. They're unfortunately more likely to be victims of homicides. And they also have limited education and work prospect. And then there is this thing called minority stress. This idea that people have to always make the calculation in the back of their mind of whether it's safe to come out with their friends, to their family, to their acquaintances, to their colleagues, whether it's safe to hold their partner hands in public. And you may think that these are minor issues, but if you think that this calculation goes in the back of people's minds for years or even decades, you can see how that can have long-term effects on their mental health and physical health. So that's for the individuals, but also for companies. Companies that promote LGBTQ plus equalities can increase profits because they can increase revenues and can reduce costs. And the first thing, they can increase revenues because they can attract more consumers. I just told you that 10% of the population is LGBTQ plus. So if firms can attract those consumers, then they can increase the revenues and so increase the profits. But I think there is an even more convincing case to be made for companies to promote LGBTQ plus equality because they can reduce cost. And they can reduce cost by making the workplace more welcoming for everyone, for women, but also for all minorities. And when people feel welcome, they feel happier, they are more productive, they are healthier, and so people tend to leave their jobs less frequently. So there is lower turnover rate, which therefore reduce cost for firm hiring costs for companies. And when people are happier, as I was saying, they're more productive. And I guess there is also this point that I always get a lot of pushback when I present in front of management people, but in many cases, you can make the case that diverse teams perform better, especially when it comes to innovation and creativity. Having people from different backgrounds that brings different ideas, different way of looking at problems does increase productivity and creativity. And you have to just believe me, you can see evidence showing that LGBT-friendly companies see an increase in their performances and also an increase in the number of patents. And finally, there are the costs for society. I always make the case of Alan Turing, which is one of the founders of computer science, but he was convicted for his homosexuality, forced to undergo chemical castration, and completed suicide shortly afterwards. And I always wonder what else he could have achieved in a more welcoming environment. But you don't have to think only about geniuses. In general, when people don't feel welcome, they tend to leave their country. And people are starting to realize that. And for instance, the Indian Supreme Court mentioned this brain drain when deciding to decriminalize homosexuality in 2018. So the bottom line is that there are high costs for economies from having homophobia and transphobia, both in their culture, but also in their laws. And from an economic perspective, this is not a zero-sum game. It's not that providing LGBT rights is going to negatively affect other people. It's going to increase economic activity, and so everyone is going to be benefiting from that. And so I hope to have convinced you that discrimination is costly, and also that I'm not reinventing the wheel. In a way, the same kind of argument have been pushed to promote anti-discrimination laws for African Americans and for women. And so in a way, we are just making the same argument also for LGBTQ plus equality. And that's pretty much all I have, and I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you.